May I now invite Dr. Bill Williams to deliver his keynote session on Publishing Engineering Education Research, Suggestions to Indian Authors.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bill Williams, an Irishman based in Portugal. And we've been doing some research into publication output of research around the world. And we've collected some data about publications from Indian researchers. And that's what I'd like to give you very briefly some data in this session, and then later in the breakout session, I talk in more detail about it. Yeah, to start with, rather than talk about publication in our field, engineering education research, I'd like to look at publication across the globe in science and engineering. And this here is a graph that I've taken from a publication that was done about 3 years ago by the National Science Foundation in the US. And this report, they were expressing concern about global science and engineering research output trends. Now, yeah, we need to go back to the graph, please. Yeah. So, looking here, this blue line here is the output from the US. And we can see between 2000 and 2020, the US output has increased very slightly, but it's a very slight increase. Then, in the same period, if we look at the output from China, we can see it's increasing very rapidly. And round about 2016, the research output from China had overtaken that of the United States. This was what was causing concern on the part of the National Science Foundation, as you can imagine. And now, looking at India, so India is the light blue, and it has also, it's rather difficult to see, but it has, in recent years, the Indian output, although it's not very clear here, has also been increasing quite rapidly, sort of in parallel with the Chinese situation. Now, moving on to the next slide, we can perhaps see a bit better. So here we're looking at columns, the one that says 2010 and the one that says 2020. So we see that between 2010 and 2020, in the field of science and engineering, China has more than doubled its publication output. The United States has increased, but it's increased incrementally. India has also more than doubled its research output. Most of the European Union countries have increased incrementally. So, in other words, between 2010 and 2020, the EU and the US, their research output has gone up gradually, whereas Chinese research output, according to publications, there is more to it, obviously, but the Chinese research output has gone up quite dramatically, and the Indian affiliated researchers has also begun increasing quite significantly. And as I say, has more than doubled in the period between 2010 and 2020. Right, so you may be thinking, okay, that's the global number of research publications in science and engineering, but what about the quality? So one way that we can have an idea of quality is looking at the same trends, but in this case, in the top 1% of journals in science and engineering. And here we see, in this case, right, this is the US. It's stayed relatively stable in the top 1% of journals. European Union, relatively stable. China, towards the end of the period, even in the top 1% of journals, is showing that it will soon probably overtake the European Union and the US in the top 1% of journals. And India is also showing very significant increases if we look back over the last 20 years. Right, so that's the situation for publication output in science and engineering globally. Now, let's turn to the situation in our particular area of interest, in engineering education research output. And here, my colleagues and I, we looked at the main journals in the field to see, almost since the beginning of time, really, 1970, to see the number of publications that have appeared, or sorry, the number of articles that have appeared in the field in all of these journals. And I think you'll note some interesting data there straight away. Sorry, can we go back again to that? Yeah. Right, the one that actually has published the most articles, but it's a bit of an outlier, is the International Journal of Engineering Education. Then the second is the European Journal of Engineering Education. And in fact, in my session later, the European Journal of Engineering Education and the US Journal of Engineering Education are the two journals, the two sort of key journals I'm going to focus on mainly. So, EJE then, second most, and Journal of Engineering Education Transformations, although having appeared very recently on the scene, has published a very large number of research papers. And you might notice that the Journal of Engineering... Yes, I think... You can take a bow, Christian. You might notice that the Journal of Engineering Education, which is the most cited and normally seen as the most prestigious journal in the field, has much smaller number of articles, although it's been publishing for 100 years. But that's it's sort of an artifact of the way we're collecting the data, because JEE up to very recently has published a lot fewer articles per year. That's the way that JEE has chosen to do it, although it's now in the process of changing, I believe. Right, so that's the number of articles that have been published in this group of journals that are related to our field. And the next thing is, what about the affiliations of the authors in these journals? And in this case, we gathered data over the last, between 2010 and 2020. As you can see, the United States is way out in front in terms of the number of articles with US affiliated authors. Spain produces they submit enormous numbers of articles. They produce a rather large number. And then in third place, we have researchers with Indian affiliation. Now, so that gives us, I think, an overall picture of what's been happening over the last 20 years. But finally, to finish, I want to share with you the data from two key journals That's the European Journal of Engineering Education, the journal of CEFI, the European Society for Engineering Education, and the Journal of Engineering Education from the American Society for Engineering Education. So the European Journal of Engineering Education, I asked the editor-in-chief of these two journals for these data. So we see for EJEE of 125 papers submitted by Indian authors, the majority were rejected. Only 3 were published. In the case of the Journal of Engineering Education, of 169 submitted, none published in JEE. I should say, and I'll talk about this in more detail in the breakout session, this isn't only peculiar, if you like, particular to the Indian context. There are the majority of papers published in JEE tend to be from the US, although it's been changing in recent years, and I'll show data later on. So if you've been following these figures that I've shared with you, I'm sure you have lots of questions, and in the breakout session, we'll try and answer some of those questions. Also, I should mention that tomorrow morning there will be a workshop at 9:30, which will also, I think, help to answer some of the questions that you might have, having seen these data. And so I'll leave you there, and hopefully see you in the session later this afternoon or tomorrow morning.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your inputs. May I request Engineer Deepak Gadhia Garu to felicitate Dr. Bill Williams, sir. Thank you, sir.